The Town Mouse and the Country Mouse. In a quiet corner of the English countryside, where golden wheat fields stretched as far as the eye could see and wildflowers dotted the rolling hills with splashes of purple and yellow, there lived a little mouse named Rusty. His home was a cozy burrow beneath the gnarled roots of an ancient oak tree, and though his accommodations were modest, Rusty considered himself the luckiest mouse in all the land. Rusty's days followed a pleasant rhythm. Each morning, he would wake with the first light of dawn, when the sky turned from deep violet to soft pink, and venture out to gather his breakfast. Sometimes he found kernels of wheat that had fallen from the farmer's cart as it trundled down the dirt road. Other times, he discovered wild berries hanging heavy on bushes, or nuts that squirrels had carelessly dropped and forgotten. His meals were simple but satisfying, and he never went to bed hungry. The country mouse had many friends among the creatures of the field. The robins would sing to him from the branches above, the rabbits would pause in their grazing to exchange pleasantries, and even the old badger who lived in the hill beyond the meadow would nod respectfully when their paths crossed. Life moved slowly here, governed by the seasons and the sun, and Rusty wouldn't have changed a thing about it. One crisp autumn afternoon, as Rusty was sorting through his winter stores of acorns and dried berries, he heard a familiar voice calling his name. He poked his head out of his burrow to see a dapper mouse standing at the entrance, whiskers perfectly groomed and fur sleek and shining. "Mortimer!" Rusty exclaimed with delight, recognizing his cousin who had moved to the city many years ago. "What a wonderful surprise! Come in, come in!" Mortimer ducked into the burrow, though not without casting a somewhat critical eye over the earthen walls and simple furnishings. Rusty noticed this look but said nothing, instead bustling about to prepare refreshments for his guest. "I've brought you some hazelnuts I found just this morning," Rusty said proudly, placing several nuts on a flat stone that served as his table. "And I have fresh spring water from the brook. Please, make yourself comfortable." Mortimer sat down gingerly on a cushion made of dried moss and examined the hazelnuts with a polite but somewhat strained smile. "How very rustic," he said carefully. "Tell me, cousin, is this what you eat every day?" "Well, yes," Rusty replied, a bit puzzled. "The hazelnuts are a special treat. Usually I have wheat, berries, roots, seeds or whatever the season provides. The food here is always fresh and wholesome." Mortimer nibbled delicately at a hazelnut, trying not to show his disappointment. "Fresh, certainly. But cousin, if you could only taste the delicacies available in the town. Why, just yesterday I dined on Stilton cheese that had been aged for months, crusty bread still warm from the baker's oven, and candied fruits that practically melted on the tongue. And that was just an ordinary Tuesday." Rusty's eyes widened with interest. He had never tasted cheese, and could barely imagine what candied fruit might be like. "It sounds quite extraordinary," he admitted. "Extraordinary? My dear Rusty, it's nothing short of magnificent." Mortimer warmed to his subject, his whiskers quivering with enthusiasm. "In the town, we don't have to wait for seasons or worry about weather. The houses are always warm in winter and cool in summer. There's food in abundance here, not just any food, but the finest fare you can imagine. Cakes with thick frosting, joints of roasted meat, puddings and pastries, jellies and jams." As Mortimer spoke, painting vivid pictures of the town's abundance, Rusty found his simple hazelnut tasting rather plain. He looked around his burrow with fresh eyes, noticing for the first time how small it was, how the walls sometimes dripped when it rained, how the winter wind found its way through tiny cracks. "You must come visit me," Mortimer declared, standing up decisively. "I insist upon it. Come and see how I live, taste the foods I've described, and experience the excitement of town life. Why bury yourself out here in the countryside when such wonders await?" Rusty hesitated. He had never been further than the neighboring farms, and the thought of traveling to the town both thrilled and frightened him. But his cousin's descriptions had awakened a curiosity he couldn't quite suppress. "Well," he said slowly, "I suppose a short visit couldn't hurt." "When would you like me to come?" "Tonight," Mortimer exclaimed. "Why wait? Pack a small bag if you must, though truly you'll need nothing. Everything you could possibly want is provided in the town." And so, as the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red, Rusty bid farewell to his cozy burrow. He took one last look at the oak tree, the familiar fields, and the peaceful countryside that had always been his home, then turned to follow Mortimer down the road toward town. The journey was longer than Rusty had anticipated. They traveled through the gathering darkness, leaving behind the open fields and entering territory Rusty had never seen before. The dirt path gave way to a proper road, then to cobblestones that hurt Rusty's feet. Unused to such hard surfaces, buildings began to appear, first scattered farmhouses, then closer together, then packed tightly side by side in long rows. The noise was overwhelming. Where the countryside had been filled with natural sounds of birds singing, wind rustling through grass, the distant lowing of cattle, the town was a cacophony of human activity. Horses' hooves clattered on the cobblestones, wagon wheels creaked and rattled, people shouted to one another, dogs barked, doors slammed. Even at night, the town never seemed to grow quiet. "Here we are," Mortimer announced proudly, stopping before a grand house 3 stories tall. Yellow light glowed from its many windows, and Rusty could hear the sounds of laughter and conversation from within. "This is where I live." "Well, not in the house itself, of course." "We'll enter through a more discreet route." Mortimer led Rusty around to the back of the house, through a garden, and to a tiny gap where the foundation met the wall. They squeezed through and found themselves in the walls of the house itself, a network of passages that ran between the rooms like secret highways. "The family who lives here has no idea how many corridors exist within their very walls," Mortimer whispered with amusement. "I can travel from the cellar to the attic without ever being seen. And the places I can go, the pantry, the kitchen, the dining room, all are accessible to those who know the way." They emerged from the walls into a pantry that took Rusty's breath away. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, laden with more food than he had ever seen in his entire life. There were wheels of cheese in various sizes and colors, some pale yellow, others deep orange, still others veined with blue. Glass jars held preserves and jellies that gleamed like jewels in the lamplight. Sacks of flour, sugar, and other staples sat in the corners. Strings of onions and garlic hung from hooks, and wooden boxes held apples, their sweet scent filling the air. "Help yourself," Mortimer said generously. "This is just the pantry. Wait until you see the kitchen after the family has finished dinner." Rusty approached the nearest wheel of cheese with reverence. He took a small bite, and his eyes closed in bliss. The flavor was rich and complex, unlike anything he'd ever tasted. He tried a bit of fruit preserve the next, then a crumb of fancy cake, then a sliver of smoked ham. "This is incredible," he breathed. "Mortimer, you were right. I had no idea such flavors existed." Mortimer preened with satisfaction. "I told you, didn't I? Why settle for hazelnuts and berries when you can feast like this every single day?" They spent the next hour sampling delicacies, with Mortimer playing the role of tour guide and pointing out his favorites. Rusty tried things whose names he couldn't even pronounce, and each new taste seemed more delicious than the last. His simple country meals seemed impossibly dull in comparison. But then, just as Rusty was reaching for a particularly tempting piece of crystallized ginger, he heard something that made his heart freeze. Footsteps. Heavy, human footsteps approaching the pantry. "Quick!" Mortimer hissed, darting toward their entrance hole. "The cook is coming." Rusty bolted after his cousin, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. They squeezed through the gap in the wall just as the pantry door opened and light flooded the room. Through a tiny crack, Rusty could see an enormous human woman entering, carrying a lamp and muttering to herself about mice getting into the stores. "That was close," Mortimer whispered once they were safely hidden. "She's been setting traps lately. We'll have to be more careful." "Traps?" Rusty's voice came out as a squeak. "What kind of traps?" "Oh, the usual sort. Spring traps, poison, that sort of thing." "And then there's Wellington, the house cat. He's a terror. That one must have caught a dozen mice this year. But don't worry, as long as you're cautious and quick, you'll be perfectly fine." Rusty's stomach, which had been feeling pleasantly full, now churned with anxiety. He thought of his peaceful burrow, where the only dangers were the occasional hawk during the day, easily avoided by staying close to cover. Here, danger seemed to lurk everywhere. "Come," Mortimer said, not noticing his cousin's distress. "Let's wait for the family to finish dinner. That's when the real feast begins." They made their way through the walls to a vantage point overlooking the dining room. Rusty watched through a small knothole as the human family sat around a magnificent table laden with dishes. The smells wafting up were intoxicating: roasted meats, fresh bread, rich sauces, sweet desserts. After what seemed like hours, The family finally finished their meal and retired to another room. Mortimer immediately led Rusty down to the dining room, where they crept out from under the sideboard to investigate the remains of the feast. "Look at all this food they've left behind," Mortimer said excitedly. "They never finish everything. Wasteful, really, but fortunate for us." Rusty had to admit that the spread was impressive. He climbed onto a chair and from there to the table itself, where crumbs of a magnificent cake lay scattered across a fine china plate. He was just reaching for a particularly large crumb when he heard a sound that turned his blood to ice. A low, rumbling purr. Rusty turned slowly to see the largest cat he had ever encountered sitting in the doorway, its green eyes fixed on him with predatory interest. The cat was orange and white, well-fed and groomed, with a collar that marked it as the beloved pet of the household. But to Rusty, it looked like a tiger. "Wellington," Mortimer breathed, his earlier confidence evaporating. "Run!" The cat sprang forward with remarkable speed for such a large creature. Rusty leapt from the table, his heart hammering, and sprinted across the floor toward the safety of the wall. He could hear the cat's claws clicking on the hardwood behind him, could feel the displacement of air as a paw swiped at his tail. He dove for the gap in the baseboard with Mortimer right behind him. They squeezed through just as Wellington's paw thrust after them, claws extended. Rusty felt one claw nick his back leg, drawing blood, before he tumbled into the safety of the wall passage. For several moments, both mice simply sat in the darkness, panting and trembling. Outside, they could hear Wellington prowling back and forth, occasionally meowing with frustration. "That was exciting," Mortimer said eventually, trying to recover his sophisticated demeanor. "Gets the blood pumping, doesn't it?" "Why, sometimes I think the danger is half the fun of it all." But Rusty wasn't listening. His leg hurt where the cat had scratched him, his heart was still racing, and he couldn't stop thinking about how close he'd come to ending up as Wellington's dinner. The delicious food he'd eaten earlier sat heavy in his stomach, and he found himself desperately missing his simple, safe burrow under the oak tree. "I know it seems frightening now," Mortimer continued, misinterpreting his cousin's silence, "but you'll get used to it. The key is to always be alert, always be ready to run. Yes, there's danger, but think of the rewards. Where else could you taste such magnificent food?" "At what cost, though?" Rusty asked quietly. "Mortimer, how can you enjoy your meals when you're always looking over your shoulder, always listening for footsteps or the padding of cat paws, when every bite might be interrupted by a run for your life?" Mortimer waved a paw dismissively. "One adjusts. The fear becomes part of the thrill. Besides, what's the alternative? Eating hazelnuts in a hole in the ground? That's no life for a mouse of ambition." But Rusty was thinking of his oak tree, his simple meals enjoyed in peace, his friends in the meadow, the quiet satisfaction of watching the stars come out over the fields. He thought of sleeping soundly through the night without worrying about cats or traps or angry cooks. He thought of the freedom to walk where he pleased without constantly calculating escape routes. "I think," Rusty said slowly, "that perhaps we have different ideas about what makes a good life." Mortimer looked at his cousin with a mixture of pity and incomprehension. "You're just tired from the journey," he said. "Get some rest. Tomorrow I'll show you the bakery. They make croissants that are absolutely divine. You'll see things differently in the morning." Rusty allowed Mortimer to lead him to a small nest the town mouse had constructed in the walls. Quite comfortable, actually, lined with soft cloth and down. But as Rusty lay there in the darkness, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the town, he found he couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house settling made him jump. Every distant sound might be a cat or a human or some other danger he hadn't yet encountered. He thought about what Mortimer had said about adjusting, about the fear becoming part of the thrill. But Rusty realized he didn't want that kind of thrill. He didn't want to eat fine cheese if it meant living in constant anxiety. He didn't want luxurious food if he couldn't enjoy it in peace. As the first light of dawn began to filter through cracks in the walls, Rusty made his decision. He gently woke Mortimer, who yawned and stretched, already planning the day's culinary adventures. "Mortimer," Rusty said gently, "I'm grateful for your hospitality, truly I am. You've shown me wonders I never would have experienced otherwise. But I think it's time for me to go home." "Home? But you've barely been here a night. You haven't seen the bakery, or tasted the puddings in the sweet shop, or "I've seen enough," Rusty interrupted kindly. "Your life here is remarkable, cousin. and I can see why it suits you. But it's not for me. I'd rather have simple fare eaten in safety than the finest feast consumed in fear." Mortimer looked genuinely baffled. "But the food, Rusty, the abundance. Don't you want more from life than mere survival?" "I want peace," Rusty replied simply. "I want to eat my meals without listening for footsteps. I want to sleep without dreaming of cats. I want to feel the sun on my fur without worrying about hawks in the sky for just a moment before diving back into hiding." In the country, yes, there are dangers, but they're natural dangers that I can manage with reasonable caution. Here, I feel like danger is everywhere, all the time. He paused, then added, "You've adapted to this life, and I admire that. But I've realized that a full belly doesn't mean much if your heart never stops racing. I'd rather have enough than too much, if having too much means never being able to relax and enjoy what I have." Mortimer was quiet for a long moment. Then he sighed. "I suppose I understand, though I think you're making a mistake. But we're different mice, you and I. What I see as excitement, you see as stress. What I view as abundance worth fighting for, you see as luxury not worth the cost." "Exactly," Rusty said, relieved that his cousin understood. "We each have to live the life that suits us best." Mortimer nodded slowly. "Well then, let me at least escort you back to the edge of town. It wouldn't do to have you get lost or caught by one of the street cats on your way out." The two cousins made their way through the awakening town as the sun climbed higher in the sky. As they left the crowded buildings behind and the landscape opened up into farmland and then familiar meadows, Rusty felt a weight lifting from his shoulders with every step. When they reached the road that led to Rusty's oak tree, the two mice paused to say their farewells. "You know you're always welcome to visit," Mortimer said. "Perhaps you'll change your mind someday." "And you're always welcome in the country," Rusty replied warmly. "Perhaps someday you'll remember the simple pleasures of a quiet life." They embraced, and then Mortimer turned back toward the town while Rusty continued on toward home. With each familiar landmark he passed, the old stone wall, the wooden bridge over the brook, the cluster of hawthorn bushes, Rusty felt his spirits rising. Finally, he spotted his ancient oak tree, standing tall and strong against the morning sky. He hurried the last distance and slipped into his burrow, which suddenly seemed not small and cramped, but cozy and welcoming. Everything was exactly as he'd left it: his stores of food, his bed of soft grass, his simple stone table. Rusty found some hazelnuts he'd set aside before leaving and sat down to eat them. They weren't fancy Stilton cheese or crystallized ginger, but they tasted wonderful, familiar and comforting. And best of all, he ate them in complete peace, with nothing to disturb him but the cheerful song of a robin in the branches above. That evening, as Rusty watched the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors and felt the gentle breeze rustling through the wheat fields, he reflected on his adventure. He had learned something important, that happiness isn't measured by abundance or luxury, but by contentment and peace of mind. In the town, Mortimer might dine on fine cheese and fancy cakes, but he would never know the deep satisfaction of simple pleasures enjoyed without fear. And here in the country, Rusty might not have exotic delicacies, but he had something more precious: the freedom to live without constantly looking over his shoulder. As he settled into his cozy bed that night, listening to the familiar sounds of the countryside, crickets chirping, a distant owl hooting, leaves rustling in the breeze, Rusty smiled to himself. He had no regrets about his journey to town. The experience had taught him to appreciate what he had, but he also had no doubt that he'd made the right choice in returning home. For Rusty had discovered a truth that many spend their whole lives learning: it is better to live humbly in security and peace than to feast luxuriously in constant danger and anxiety. A simple life, lived well and enjoyed fully, is worth more than all the riches in the world if those riches come at the cost of one's peace of mind. And so the country mouse lived contentedly ever after in his burrow beneath the oak tree, grateful for his simple blessings and never once wishing he had stayed in the town. And whenever he ate his modest meals of hazelnuts and berries, he did so with a grateful heart, knowing that true wealth lies not in what you eat, but in the peace with which you eat it. The end. Moral: better a simple life in safety than a life of luxury lived in fear.